thank you for the introduction, and thank you so much for inviting us to come and talk about our monitoring program for the agricultural landscapes. I will begin. Unfortunately, as you can see on this first slide, the next person in line is Grete Stokstad. She unfortunately could not join us today. She had to be somewhere else urgently. So it'll be me and my two colleagues, Pedersen and Hanne Sickel, who will give this presentation, and we hope to be able to answer your questions even for our colleagues that are not here. Okay, so I will say a little bit about the history and the development before taking on Grete's task and talking about the area bit of the monitoring program. And the background for all of this was the realized changes of agricultural landscapes. And you can see here two examples of monitoring squares. They're both kilometer square. And it's the exact same landscape. And this, the first image, the first map, shows the situation of this agricultural landscape in the 1960s. And then you see what it looked like some 30 years later. And the key words driving this process was the desire for increased specialization, effectivization, and intensification of agricultural productions. And of course, these changes, and I'm sure similar changes happened in many parts of Europe, they had many effects, not all acknowledged beforehand, as is often the case. So the Ministry of Agriculture, as it was called at the time, and the Ministry of the Environment decided, being made aware of all these changes happening at a very rapid pace in some locations, that we needed monitoring. It was the only way to keep track of what was actually happening. And it was inspired by the Countryside Survey of the UK. They initiated this development of a monitoring program as a project in the mid-1990s. And then in 1998, the Norwegian monitoring program for agricultural landscapes started. Before we go into details on that, I just would like to say a few words about Norwegian agricultural landscapes. And I think this image, satellite imagery from on the side here, illustrates quite a bit about what Norway is like. And only 3.5% of the total land area of Norway, you see the yellow square marking 3.5%, is fully cultivated land. However, if we take that and we distribute it the way agriculture in Norway is in fact distributed, it looks like this. So in Norway, it's a very small proportion of the land area that is in fact fully cultivated or cultivated land, but it's everywhere. So based on this realization, it was apparent that to monitor Norwegian agricultural landscapes, some sort of stratification was needed. I will get into the methodology behind this. But we are then responsible for this monitoring of agricultural landscapes, and we have been so since its initiation. In Norway, I just have to mention there are other monitoring activities as well. For instance, for forest, the so-called landskogstakseringen, which has been going on for more than 100 years. There is a Norwegian breeding bird survey. There is a monitoring of semi-natural grassland and monitoring of nature types. But what I will be focusing on, and we will be focusing on, is this 3Q program. It's a bit cryptic. It's an acronym based on some Norwegian words, which is a sample-based program to record state and monitor changes in Norwegian agricultural landscapes. You see the aims here. This illustration, which was also used on the first slide of the presentation, or the information slide, by a colleague of ours, Ulrike Bayer, this beautiful drawing actually captures most of the activities we have in our monitoring program. And we will talk about different ones of these. So The sample-based program, as StreQ is actually based on a systematic grid of 3 by 3 kilometers square, where squares were included if they contained agricultural land according to the land cover map. And our first method or key method is based on aerial photography. And in Norway, we have a routine of aerial photo survey according to a plan. And you see that different parts of Norway is the colors illustrate years, and different parts of Norway is included in this plan every year. And this is what we use as our sort of base data. We get these aerial photos. They are in true color, and they are of a scale of approximately 1 to 5,000. And we use them to make maps. And we have a hierarchical classification system, which at its very most detailed level, there are 3 levels, very most detailed level. We have some 100 different land cover classes. So we have approximately 1,000 squares, and we circle Norway in a more or less 5-year interval. Since we cannot really provide statistics, nor is it interesting, given that there is a forest inventory also, we focus on agricultural areas. And the agricultural area with a 100-meter buffer zone are mapped in very much detail. On the biodiversity monitoring squares, however, which is a subsample of approximately 100, slightly more than 100 squares, we map the total area. So we record land use and a number of landscape elements, and then we report on state and change over 5 years. And we do that in relation to agricultural area. And one example of things we report are field size and edge length per hectare of cultivated land. So an example of things that we report is this loss on gain of agricultural land. And as you can imagine, with so limited agricultural area in Norway, this is something that, for instance, policymakers are very much interested in. And we report on various spatial scales, and but we cannot go further down than to the county level. However, what we also see is that the counties are administrative boundaries. And in fact, in Norway, it's landscape features that dictates more of what is happening in the land. And what you see here is an example of agricultural land on these landscape region or the agricultural regions. And as you can see, there are pronounced differences between lowland East Norway, for instance, and the coast of mid-Norway and the northern parts of the country. So in general, agricultural land is being lost as you move to the coast and northwards to abandonment and forestry, while in the southeastern lowlands, the loss is to a larger extent actually development. So in addition to all of these land use, land cover maps and statistics that we make, we also record a number of other features, landscape elements, both in terms of lines and points. And some of them, of course, are included because they are of particular importance to biodiversity, as they are key habitat in agricultural landscapes. So that was very briefly a little bit about the history of the program and the area mapping that we do. And I now give the floor to my colleague, Hanne Sickel, which will talk about the plants and the monitoring of plants that we do.
Thank you. You can hear me clearly, I hope?
Yes, we hear you perfectly.
Good. So, within the 3Q monitoring program, we also monitor biodiversity by fieldwork. And I will now tell you about the monitoring of vascular plants. The monitoring of vascular plants started in 2004 in 97 of the 1,001 square kilometers in the program. This monitoring focus on the biodiversity in pastures and unmanaged grasslands. Within those squares, altogether 569 permanent plots of 64 square meters were established, and all were visited in the period 2004 till 2008. Within the plots, all vascular plants and some environmental variables were recorded, and species cover abundance of all species were estimated. This was repeated from 2011 to 2018. So we have now data from 2 periods and have started on the 3rd period of data collection. The data from the first 2 periods have been analyzed, and key questions addressed in the data analysis so far is which plant communities are represented in the dataset, and what is the distribution of the study plots across these communities at the first and second recording intervals. Have there been shifts in land use and ecological condition? Which species have increased in frequency and which have declined? And do these successional changes have implications for pollinating insects? To answer the first question, we identified 4 grassland types in the data material based on the species composition within the plots. And these grassland types can be described as moderately fertilized or moist pastures, overgrown agricultural land, cultivated pastures and disturbed ground, natural unfertilized pastures, and outfield pastures. Did we find shifts in land use and ecological condition? The answer is yes. The species composition within the plots had changed significantly between the periods. The overall trend in the data material was regrowth. Woodland and succession species occurred more frequently in the plots in the second period, while grassland species, for example herbs important to bees and bumblebees, had declined. Also, plants indicating a more humid climate occurred more frequently in 2 grassland types. 2 species indicating more humid climate is, for instance, Juncus effusus and Juncus conglomeratus. Intensification is also a trend in our data material. And as we can see here, in 2008, this pasture was unfertilized. In 2018, it has been fertilized, and the grass cover is much higher on the cost of flowering herbs. To conclude, the primary successional trend is land abandonment leading to widespread scrub encroachment. The main driver of biodiversity loss is a combination of abandonment, in some areas and agricultural intensification in others. When it comes to floral shifts, specialized meadow species are declining, while competitors favored by lack of grazing, moisture-demanding species, and nitrophilous disturbance-tolerant species are increasing. So we can also conclude that the floral changes we have seen unfortunately have negative implications for pollinating insects. We have, as you can see, observed significant ecological shifts within a short temporal window, which highlights the value and importance of systematic grassland monitoring. And I will now hand the microphone over to my colleague Christian.
Thank you, Hanne. So I'm going to start talking about the monitoring of farmland birds. And the monitoring of farmland birds happens on 130 of the monitoring squares. And you can see the distribution of those squares across Norway. And on these squares, we have 9 observation points where observers go out to each point and monitor breeding pairs seen and heard for 5 minutes per point. We do this, or every monitoring square is visited every 3 years or so. We do this in close cooperation with BirdLife Norway, so they pick out the experts to go out and monitoring the birds. But what we also can do on these monitoring squares is to look at the spatial structure, because when they do monitoring the birds, they also write down what habitat type or land type they are observed in. So we can also then look at the spatial structure of all the different land types. And we developed this heterogeneity index, which is basically the proportion of neighboring points that are on different land types. That says something about the spatial structure. So we can then also look at the spatial heterogeneity and also the land type diversity. And so here is 2 monitoring squares. The one to the left, where you have 8 different land types and a low heterogeneity index. The index goes from 0 to 1. And on the right, you have a lot of land type diversity, 20, and then you have a relatively high heterogeneity index. And what we have done is that we have looked at the relationship between the number of species and number of individuals or birds versus the land type diversity and the spatial heterogeneity. And as the red arrow points towards the most preferred habitat, where up to the far right, that's where we find that kind of habitat and landscape is where we find the most species and the most individuals of farmland birds. But we have also developed a farmland bird index where we have the baseline year is the year we started monitoring birds, which is the year 2000, which is the baseline year, and then we compare every other year after that with the baseline year. And then we have developed this index that shows steady decline with the fastest decline in birds in the beginning of the period. And we have done this for 22 species combined. We have approximately 34 species of farmland bird in Norway, but we have tried to be conservative and chose 22 species that are so common on the monitoring squares that we are very certain about how the populations develop over time. But we can also break this down and look at farmland bird index for the 22 species individually. And a lot of them are showing decline throughout that since 2000. Only a few of them, 4 of the 22 species, are showing a slight increase or a stable population. So it's not a very a positive picture. So that's the birds, and then I'm going to continue with monitoring of pollinators that our colleague Wenche Fjeldstad is sort of the leader of. And I'm going to talk about the bumblebees and butterflies. So this is sort of citizen science, because we have a recording by paid volunteers, but they are chosen by an organization that we cooperate with called Sabima. And the people that are going out and monitoring are both experts, but also beginners. But they are going through a training program before they are released in the wild. And what they're doing is identifying living insects in the field. So what we have done is that we had 10 squares of these monitoring squares in the period 2021 to 24, and then 10 other squares in 2025. And for the bumblebees, that are very hard to distinguish, we have grouped them together. So the complicated or species that are difficult to identify in the field are grouped together. So how we do this is that we record along field edges, and we have chosen edges along fully cultivated land. And we have 20 transects, each of 50 meters, and as connected as possible, depending on how the monitoring squares look. And then we record all bumblebees and butterflies 2.5 meters to either side of the transect, 5 meters forwards and then upwards. But at the same time as we walk along these transects, we record a flower cover. And as with the birds, we can also relate the pollinator abundance to the landscape and landscape diversity. So here we see a figure of the number of individuals of pollinators versus the diversity of land types. And we see a positive relationship between land type diversity and pollinator number of individuals of pollinators over, this is a 3-year period, the first 10 squares. But we can also compare the number of pollinators versus the heterogeneity index, like I mentioned during the bird talk. We see also here a positive relationship between the number of individuals and the number of species of pollinators versus heterogeneity of the landscape. But most importantly is that the more flowers we have, the more pollinators. So here is 2 figures of the number of individuals of pollinators and the number of species versus flower cover that they are measuring while they walk the transects. And there's a positive relationship there. So we need a lot of flowers in the landscape, but they also need to be spread out and not just clumped together in one corner of the landscape. So that's the bird and pollinator monitoring. And that's the end of our presentation. And we are happy to answer any questions. Thank you.